mother, tell your children not to walk my way. Tell your children not to hear my words, what they mean, what they say.
Hello, and of course this is not the video I wanted to do today. I wanted to do a review video today, but came home and found out that the fabulous Moolah had passed away. So I thought I would come on here and kind of just give my opinions on her and just why this is probably a bigger deal than a lot of people think. I know a lot of people that watch probably only ever know anything of her because of the Attitude Era, but the fact that they have said that at one point she was an incredible wrestler, and really she was. If one of my little passions with wrestling is actually going back and finding late 40s to early 60s women's wrestling matches, because in fact, in my opinion, they hold up better than the men's matches do. The women's matches were a little bit faster paced. Have you ever seen anything from that time period as far as men's matches go? They were pretty methodical, pretty, just kind of not. I'm not gonna say boring, because you can watch a Luthez match and it not be boring, but a lot of guys were pretty boring, to be honest. And if you don't understand kind of what you're watching, but the women's matches weren't that way. For the most part, they were a little bit more athletic. They were a little bit more of what you see, particularly probably I would say in the 70s and 80s, probably even more in the 80s. A lot of the women were gymnasts and dancers and stuff like that, so they incorporated a lot of that into their wrestling stuff. You didn't have a lot of women who, for those of you who don't know, women's wrestling actually came from the carny scene, from carnivals, much like pro wrestling did, where you would have women who would challenge men and would beat them in wrestling matches. So you did have women that knew how to wrestle, but a lot of the women who wrestled professionally were they came from swimming or gymnastics or dance or something else, and they had been picked up or scouted and brought in by a promoter and taught how to wrestle, and it was much more of what we could consider sports entertainment, more so than what was going on the men's side of things. But Moolah, without a doubt, was probably, of all of these women during that period, was the best. She was the biggest draw. Her and her then husband were the biggest promoters of women's wrestling, and her importance on women's wrestling is huge, to say the least. She is probably the most important women's wrestler there has ever been, and that is putting it quite mildly. Her and her husband had what you do. You had basically had two, I believe there was at the time, two warring factions that toured with women's wrestling back at that time, and there was her and her husband's, and then there was another one, and her and her husband's were the biggest, and then of course she wound up aligning herself with the McMahons, and I would imagine that the WWE will probably do a pretty big tribute to her, I would think, because her importance to the McMahon family is pretty big. I mean, she would be considered right along the same lines as Andre the Giant as far as importance to the McMahon family, and particularly to Vince McMahon Sr. and the importance there. But Moolah was, if you ever get a chance, there are very select, but there are some matches from that time period who are you can check out, particularly some of hers, and it is amazing how good she was. Let alone the fact that if you look at her match, most of you, probably the most recent match that I can think of in which she was still kind of in her prime, would have been her match with Wendy Richter. If you go back there, I believe she was 50 at that time and was still able to go out there and do good stuff. And as MB said on his video, the fact that she was able to walk out with Victoria and put on what looked like a believable match even at her age was just amazing. But the best thing I can tell most of you to do is there's a actual documentary on women's wrestling during Moolah's heyday called Lipstick and Dynamite. It is an amazing documentary. It's one I would recommend. I'm going to put the link to the trailer. I believe it's on DVD. They show it on Showtime a lot. If any of you have Showtime, you should be able to find it on the net if you want to look on the net, I would imagine. But it's called Lipstick and Dynamite. It's an excellent documentary in which they go and they find all these women who used to wrestle then, and they talk to them, and it's very fascinating to listen to their stories and how it was back then. And the fact, for example, that one of the reason why, if you ever see uh, wrestlers, men, talk from that area, and they talk about women's wrestling, and they don't really talk about it in a great light. And a lot of these women a couple of them state that the reason is because if they were on the same show as a women's wrestling match, the women usually um, got a much better reaction and put on much more entertaining, not necessarily better matches, but much more entertaining matches in some regards, particularly if you had two of the top women. And Moolah was one of those women. She definitely set a standard for, I wouldn't just say women in this country, but also women in Japan, as to just how to go out there and how to put on a good match, yet be a woman. And there's a lot of people that say, she could have walked out there with a lot of men and wrestled a lot of men and held her own in the ring. That was long before China ever, ever. So I just wanted to come on here and say that this is pretty important, and I would recommend all of you who don't know a lot about her to do some research on her. Just see how important she was, and not just the fact that WWE comes out and says, oh, she was important, she's a Hall of Famer, this, that. No, really, she's very, very important to the wrestling business, and particularly on the women's side of things. I would imagine, like I said, I will be shocked if they don't do some sort of massive tribute to her on Raw, particularly. She was very close to the McMahons. Like I said, she was very close to Vince McMahon Sr., and I know Vince McMahon just thought the world of her. I believe she had worked with the McMahons longer than anybody ever, so that pretty much should tell you something. And like I said, I would imagine in the halls of the McMahon family, she was probably right up there with Andre the Giant. And for those of you that understand kind of the dichotomy of Andre the Giant and the WWE and kind of his importance to the WWE, WWF, and particularly with Vince McMahon Sr., it really kind of, I imagine a pretty big tribute, and I'll be kind of disappointed if there's not, to be honest. But again, for those of you that you just can't fathom how important she was to this business, like I said, go check out Lipstick and Dynamite, which does a pretty good job of explaining her role, her importance to women's wrestling, her importance to wrestling in general. And also just do some research. Definitely, she's somebody that I definitely think a lot of you should check out, do some research on, and just see how important she was, because I keep saying that, but she was very important to this business. She was a very, very good wrestler, and it's sad to see her go. It really is. She left a very long legacy, which, it's kind of sad that here in the States you don't really see anyone picking up that legacy. And just as she's, passes away, you have Shimmer, which is probably the closest thing we've seen as far as women's wrestling goes, to just be somewhat successful since the days of her in her prime. So hopefully somebody at some point gave her a Shimmer DVD and let her see, that there were wrestling as she was and not just the diva stuff. Anyways, that's just all I had. I just wanted to come on here and say that. Again, I've got the link to the trailer for Lipstick and Dynamite. And as I said, just go and check out and just see how important she was to this business. And if you can find any matches of hers, I would definitely check it out. I don't know if there's any in YouTube. I've never found any matches of hers on YouTube, but I definitely would also say check out any women's wrestling matches that you can find from that era as well, because it's kind of interesting to see the difference between the women's matches and the men's matches back then, and just to see how wrestling has evolved, and it looks a little bit more like the women wrestled back then. But anyways, that's all. I'm out. As I said, this is pretty sad, and at least she's in a better place now, and she definitely left a long legacy that will be a tough one to fill. So I'm out. Bye.
That's right.